8 years of my life can be summarized by the sound of a dry, corporate handshake. It was a crisp, hollow noise that echoed through the glass-walled conference room of Meridian Tech, a sound that signaled the precise moment my career was stripped for parts. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I stood there, my face a mask of practiced indifference, watching Madeline Kerr beam at Tommy Halloway as if he had just discovered fire instead of merely being born into the right social circle. "Congratulations to Tommy," I said, my voice as smooth as polished chrome. Internally, I was cataloging the sheer absurdity of it. Tommy was 27, possessed the attention span of a moth, and had a grasp of our systems that could best be described as optimistic guesswork. Yet here he was, sliding into the senior project manager chair I had built from the ground up. Madeline glanced at me, her smile tightening at the corners. She valued family culture, which was corporate speak for rewarding people she liked to have drinks with. "Damon, we really appreciate your transition support. It's about the team, right?" "Always," I replied. I was escorted out 10 minutes later. Security didn't touch me, I didn't give them the satisfaction. But the presence of a uniformed guard hovering 3 feet behind me as I cleared my desk was a nice touch of theater. My colleagues, people I had shared coffee and crises with for nearly a decade, suddenly found their computer screens incredibly fascinating. Marcus Yates, my supposed office rival and once friend, didn't even look up. He was already leaning over Tommy's shoulder, pointing at a monitor and laughing at some private joke. The air in the office felt stagnant, filtered through too many vents and egos. At the HR desk, I handed over my badge and a blue notebook. The HR representative, a woman named Sarah who smelled faintly of peppermint and anxiety, reached for it, but I held on to the corner for a second longer than necessary. "The specs for the Q4 rollout are in there," I told her, my tone helpful and earnest. "Every variable, every contingency. Tommy will need it for the presentation tomorrow morning. It's quite technical, but I've simplified it as much as I could for him." "Thank you, Damon," she murmured, finally tugging it away. "We wish you the best." I walked out of the revolving doors and into the biting chill of the city afternoon. The sun was hanging low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the concrete. I didn't feel the weight of unemployment. I felt the lightness of a man who had just planted a garden of very specific, very patient seeds. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. 8 years. I had stayed late when everyone else left, solved the glitches that kept the servers humming, and protected the company from its own incompetence. And they had discarded me for a man who thought infrastructure was a type of Pilates. The unfairness didn't make me angry. Anger is messy, loud, and prone to mistakes. It made me cold. It made me precise. As I drove home, my phone buzzed in the center console. A text from my sister, Lara. "Heard about the news. So sorry, Damon. Maybe it's for the best? You were so stressed." I didn't reply. I knew Lara was already planning a sympathy dinner that would somehow involve me paying for her drinks while she told me how well Tommy was doing. She moved in the same circles as Madeline's social group. Her sympathy was just a way to gather more details for the gossip mill. Everyone was a part of the mesh now. Everyone had a role to play in the architecture of this betrayal. My apartment was a minimalist fortress of glass and steel, perched high enough to look down on the city but low enough to feel its pulse. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dim glow of the street lamps reflecting off the ceiling and pulled up my laptop. I had left the office, but I hadn't left the network, not entirely. The blue notebook I had given HR was a masterpiece of misinformation. I hadn't lied about the data. I had simply omitted the crucial sequencing of the logic gates. To an untrained eye like Tommy's, it looked like a roadmap to success. To anyone who actually understood the architecture of the Meridian servers, it was a manual for a controlled, embarrassing cascade of errors. Around 9 p.m., the urge to see the initial cracks became irresistible. I knew the security protocols better than the people who wrote them. I drove back toward the office, parking 3 blocks away in a shadow-drenched garage. Re-entering the building was a matter of timing and a flaw in the loading dock's magnetic lock that I had pointed out 6 months ago, a flaw Madeline had refused to budget for. I slipped inside, the silence of the empty office floors pressing against my ears. It was hauntingly quiet, the only sound the hum of the HVAC system and the distant whine of a street sweeper outside. I made my way to Tommy's new office. It was already decorated with a framed photo of him on a yacht, and a world's best boss mug that was clearly a self-purchase. I sat in his chair. It was too soft, lacking the ergonomic support required for actual work. I didn't break anything. I didn't steal anything. Instead, I began a series of subtle adjustments. I rearranged his digital filing system, nesting folders within folders using a logic that would appear sound but prove impossible to navigate under pressure. I adjusted the sensitivity on his peripherals and set a recurring, invisible script that would cause his presentation remote to lag by exactly 3 seconds, just enough to make him look clumsy, just enough to break his rhythm. I looked at the blue notebook sitting on his desk. He had already underlined parts of it in a bright, arrogant yellow highlighter. He was going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning with all the confidence of a king and the foundation of a house of cards. A noise echoed from the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the night security guard. I didn't panic. I knew his route. He stopped at the break room for coffee every hour on the hour. I stepped into the shadows of the supply closet, watching through the slat as the flashlight beam swept across the carpet. The light skipped over Tommy's desk, reflecting off the yacht photo before moving on. As I exited the building through the same loading dock, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about a job. It was about the fundamental disrespect of assuming I was too small to strike back. They thought I was a line of code they could just delete. They forgot that I was the one who wrote the operating system. I reached my car and saw a familiar silhouette leaning against the driver's side door. It was Marcus. He looked startled to see me coming from the direction of the office, his keys dangling from his hand. "Damon, what are you doing here this late?" he asked, his voice tensing. He tried to project a sense of authority, but I could see the way his eyes darted toward the building. He was likely there to finish some of the work Tommy couldn't handle, proving his loyalty to the new regime. "I left a personal item," I said, walking closer until I was well within his personal space. I was taller than Marcus, and in the low light of the garage, I saw him swallow hard. Just making sure everything is in its right place. "Look, man, about the promotion. It wasn't my call," Marcus stammered, stepping back. "Business is business." "I agree," I said, stepping even closer. I reached out and adjusted his collar, my fingers lingering for a second too long near his throat. It wasn't a strike, but the threat was implicit in the silence. "And business is about to get very interesting for all of you." I brushed past him and got into my car. As I pulled away, I watched him in the rearview mirror. He was standing perfectly still, watching my taillights fade. He knew me well enough to be worried, but he didn't know me well enough to know why. The next morning would be the presentation. Madeline would be there, her bosses would be there, and Tommy would be holding my blue notebook like a shield. I drove home, the city lights blurring into long streaks of neon. My internal commentary was a steady hum of calculation. I thought about Lara's text, about Marcus's stutter, and about Madeline's hollow handshake. They were all connected. They were all complicit in the idea that loyalty was a one-way street. I arrived at my apartment and went straight to the balcony, looking out over the grid of the city. Tomorrow, the first domino would fall. It wouldn't be loud, and it wouldn't be messy. It would be a slow, agonizing realization that they had invited a ghost into their machine. I checked my watch. In 12 hours, Tommy would stand up in front of the board. He would open the notebook, and he would begin to speak. And I would be there, watching from the periphery, ensuring that every word he uttered became a brick in the wall of his own professional ruin. The anticipation was better than any sleep I could have had. I went inside, closed the laptop, and waited for the sun to rise on the first day of their collective education. The underdog was no longer under anyone's heel. The underdog was the architect now. The morning of the Meridian Tech quarterly briefing arrived with a pale, indifferent sun. I sat in a small cafe 3 blocks from the headquarters, a place where the baristas knew my order but didn't know my name. It was the perfect vantage point. From my tablet, I accessed the building's internal security feed, a backdoor I had installed years ago during a system migration that didn't exist, according to the official documentation. The feed was grainy, but I could see the high-tension shuffle of the 10th floor. Tommy Halloway was pacing the hallway outside the main conference room. Even through a low-resolution camera, his agitation was palpable. He was clutching the blue notebook like a religious artifact, his lips moving as he rehearsed lines he clearly hadn't mastered. Behind him, Madeline Kerr appeared, looking sharp in a charcoal suit. She patted him on the shoulder, a gesture of maternal corporate confidence that made my jaw tighten. She thought she had picked a winner. She thought she had traded a complicated, expensive asset, me, for a cheaper, more malleable one. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was bitter, exactly how I liked it. The briefing began at 9 a.m. sharp. I couldn't hear the audio, but I didn't need to. I watched the screen as Tommy stood before the board of directors and the primary stakeholders. He pulled up the first slide of the presentation I had prepared. Or rather, the presentation he thought I had prepared. On the screen, the data looked impeccable. Beautifully rendered charts, soaring projections, and a clear path to the Q4 rollout. Then came the pivot. Tommy reached the section where the technical specs from the blue notebook were supposed to be integrated. He clicked the remote. The 3-second lag I had programmed into his hardware caused him to click again, thinking the first command hadn't registered. The presentation skipped 2 slides ahead, landing directly on a complex architectural map of the server farm. Tommy froze. He tried to go back, but the lag caught up, skipping him forward again. He looked like a man trying to catch a falling glass. The more he moved, the worse the situation became. I watched Madeline's face in the corner of the frame. Her smile didn't disappear. It just became frozen, a mask of professional politeness that was slowly cracking. Tommy began to speak, his hands waving frantically as he tried to explain the logic gates I had intentionally mislabeled in the notebook. One of the board members leaned forward, pointing at a specific line of code on the screen. I knew that line. It was a recursive loop that, while harmless to the hardware, looked like a catastrophic security flaw to anyone with an engineering degree. The board member spoke. Tommy stammered. He looked down at the blue notebook, frantically flipping through the pages. But I had written the technical explanations in a jargon-heavy shorthand that required my specific knowledge to decipher. To Tommy, it was Sanskrit. To the board, it looked like he was reading a menu in a language he didn't speak. The feed showed the board members beginning to whisper to one another. Madeline checked her watch. This was the first crack in the foundation. It wasn't the end. I didn't want it to be that quick, but it was the end of his untouchable status. I closed the tablet. I had other errands to run. My next stop was the parking garage of Marcus Yates's apartment complex. Marcus was the kind of man who defined his worth by his vehicle, a sleek silver European sedan that he waxed twice a week. He had been my friend since college, or so I had thought until I found the email chain between him and Madeline. He hadn't just remained silent during my ousting. He had actively lobbied for it, claiming my rigid methods were holding the team back. The garage was quiet, smelling of damp concrete and exhaust. I found his car parked in its reserved spot. I didn't use a crowbar or a spray can. Those were the tools of amateurs. Instead, I knelt by the front driver's side wheel. I had a small, specialized electronic bypass tool. Within seconds, I had accessed the car's onboard computer system. I didn't disable the brakes. That would be crude and dangerous. I simply recalibrated the proximity sensors and the electronic parking brake. I set the sensors to be hypersensitive. Every time he went over 5 miles per hour, the car would scream at him that he was about to hit an invisible object. More importantly, I programmed the electronic parking brake to engage whenever the car reached a complete stop for more than 3 seconds. It would be a nightmare of mechanical stubbornness. Every red light would become a battle. Every stop sign would be a humiliation. As I walked away, my phone rang. It was Claire Sanders, a junior analyst at Meridian who hadn't yet learned how to be cynical. Damon, are you okay? The meeting? It's a disaster, she whispered, her voice muffled as if she were hiding in a restroom stall. I'm doing fine, Claire. Why? What's happening? Tommy is falling apart. He's blaming the data. He actually told the board that you must have made a mistake in the notes. Madeline looks like she wants to disappear. But Damon, Marcus is telling everyone that you did this on purpose. He's saying you sabotaged the handoff. Marcus always did have a vivid imagination, I said, my voice flat. Thanks for the heads up, Claire. Stay out of the crossfire. I hung up. So Marcus was already trying to frame the narrative. I had expected that. It was time to deal with the family element of this betrayal. I drove to the gym where my sister Lara spent her mid-morning hours. Lara was a social climber who viewed my career as a ladder she could use to reach higher circles. I had recently discovered, through a series of accidental overlaps in our digital lives, that she had been providing Madeline with insight into my mental state, suggesting I was burnt out and looking for an exit. She had paved the way for my dismissal to secure a lucrative consulting contract for her own boutique PR firm with Meridian. I saw her through the glass front of the gym, running on a treadmill, looking effortless and polished. I entered the building and went to the locker room area. It was easy enough to find her locker. She always used the same combination, our childhood address. Inside her bag was her phone. I didn't steal it. I simply opened the messaging app. I found her thread with Madeline. He's really struggling, Em. I think a break would be the best thing for him. He's becoming unstable. I felt a cold prickle of recognition. My own sister had used my dedication against me, painting it as a breakdown to line her own pockets. I downloaded a specific set of images from her cloud storage. Nothing illicit, just documents. Specifically, the invoices she had sent to Meridian Tech for consulting services that had started months before I was let go. Then, I sent a BCC of those invoices to a few of her other clients, along with a polite, anonymous note suggesting that her firm might be double billing for overlapping market research. I replaced the phone and left. By the time she finished her workout, her professional reputation would be under a microscope. I was back in my car when I saw Marcus's silver sedan pull out of the garage across the street. I followed at a distance. He was heading toward the office, likely called in to help Tommy clean up the mess. He reached the first intersection. The light turned red. He stepped on the brakes and came to a complete stop. 1, 2, 3. I watched as his car suddenly lurched. The electronic parking brake had engaged. The light turned green. Marcus stepped on the gas, but the car didn't move. The engine revved, the tires chirped against the asphalt, but the vehicle was anchored. Behind him, a delivery truck began to honk. Marcus leaned out the window, waving his arms in frustration. He was frantically pressing buttons on his dashboard. Finally, the brake released with a violent jar, and he jerked forward, only for the proximity sensors to begin their high-pitched, panicked wailing. He pulled over to the side of the road, jumping out of the car and kicking the front tire. He looked small and ridiculous, a man defeated by his own prized possession. I pulled up alongside him, lowering my window. "Car trouble, Marcus?" I asked, my tone conversational. He spun around, his face flushed with heat. "Damon, how did you—" "It's a sophisticated machine, Marcus. Sometimes if you don't treat the internal components with respect, they stop working for you. It's all about the architecture." "You did something to it," he hissed, stepping toward my car. "I know you did. I'm telling Madeline. I'm telling the police." "Tell them whatever you like," I said, leaning back in my seat. "But while you're at it, you might want to explain to Madeline why you've been BCCing yourself on all of Tommy's private project logs. I saw the server history before I left Marcus. You weren't just helping him. You were preparing to replace him the moment he tripped, and he just tripped very, very hard." The color drained from his face. He hadn't known I had seen that. He was a shark, but I was the ocean. "We're not friends anymore, Marcus. We're just two people who happen to know where all the bodies are buried in this company. The difference is, I'm the one with the shovel." I drove off, leaving him standing on the curb next to his screaming car. The afternoon was descending, and the first layer of my plan was complete. Tommy was disgraced, Marcus was terrified, and Lara was about to be audited by her own industry. But the real target, the one who had signed the papers and smiled while she did it, was still sitting in her corner office, thinking she could contain the fire. As I circled back toward my apartment, I saw a black SUV following me. It stayed 2 cars back, mimicking my lane changes with practiced precision. I didn't feel fear. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the part of the game I enjoyed most. They were finally starting to realize that I wasn't just a disgruntled ex-employee, I was a consequence. I accelerated, weaving through a gap in the city traffic. The SUV surged to keep up. I led them through a series of narrow side streets, testing their reflexes. They were good, but they were driving a heavy vehicle in a city built for smaller, more agile movements. I turned into a narrow alleyway that I knew ended in a sharp, restricted turn onto a main boulevard. I hit the gas, the engine of my car whining in protest. The SUV roared behind me, closing the gap. At the last second, I slammed on my brakes, drifted the rear of the car through the turn, and accelerated out onto the boulevard, slipping between 2 buses. The SUV attempted the same maneuver, but its wheelbase was too wide. I heard the sickening scrape of metal against brick as it got wedged in the mouth of the alley. I didn't look back. I reached my apartment and sat on the floor, my back against the door. My heart was steady. My mind was a grid of upcoming events. The betrayal was deep, involving the people I had trusted most in the world, but the retribution would be deeper. I pulled out my phone and looked at a photo I had taken years ago, a picture of the entire team at a Christmas party. Madeline, Tommy, Marcus, and even Lara was there as a guest. We were all laughing. It looked like a family. I deleted the photo. The true twist was yet to come. I had found a file in the Meridian archive during my final hour, a file that showed Lara hadn't just suggested my exit. She had been the one to provide Madeline with the falsified performance reviews that justified my termination without a severance package. My own sister had sold my career for a contract. I stood up and went to my desk. I had a lot of work to do before the board meeting tomorrow. The second act was beginning. The city after dark is a different machine entirely, one fueled by electricity and the quiet desperation of people trying to outrun their own shadows. I spent the following morning in a state of clinical observation, watching the fallout from the previous day's presentation ripple through the professional ecosystem of Meridian Tech. My laptop was a window into their crumbling world. Internal emails were flying with the frantic energy of a hive that had just lost its queen. The board was demanding a system audit, and Tommy was reportedly locked in his office, refusing to take calls from the IT department. I sat in a low-rent diner on the edge of the financial district, the kind of place where the grease on the walls is older than the patrons. It was the perfect spot to remain invisible while I tightened the noose. My focus now shifted to the financial aspect of the betrayal. If Madeline Kerr was the architect and Tommy was the opportunistic placeholder, then my sister Lara was the broker who had facilitated the transaction. I began by accessing the hidden partition I'd discovered in the company's cloud storage. It was a digital black box where Madeline kept the more creative accounting records, specifically the kickbacks disguised as consulting fees paid to Lara's firm. As I scrolled through the ledgers, the depth of the collusion became clear. This wasn't just about my job. It was a systematic looting of the project budget I had spent 3 years securing. They had stripped my department of its resources to fund their own private interests, using my supposed instability as the smokescreen to cover the missing funds. The irony was as sharp as a razor. They had called me unreliable to hide their own theft. I took another bite of lukewarm toast and sent a second anonymous package of data, this time to the internal compliance officer at the bank that handled Lara's business accounts. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to trigger a standard know your customer investigation. Once the bank saw the source of those Meridian payments and the lack of corresponding work product, her accounts would be frozen within 48 hours. The social climber was about to lose her ladder. By midday, I was back on the streets. I needed to move. The stationary act of plotting was necessary, but the physical execution provided a different kind of satisfaction. I headed toward a high-end gym located in the heart of the tech corridor, a place where Marcus Yates spent his lunch hours trying to sweat away his insecurities. I didn't enter as a member. I used a service entrance, the code for which was still the factory default, a common oversight in secure buildings that I had documented and ignored during my tenure at Meridian. The interior smelled of expensive air filtration and ambition. I found Marcus in the weight room, his face bright red as he struggled with a bench press that was clearly 5 pounds beyond his actual capability. I didn't approach him immediately. I stood by the water station, watching him in the mirror. He looked haunted. Every time his phone buzzed on the floor next to him, he flinched. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I was more than happy to provide the footwear. When he finished his set, gasping for air, I stepped into his line of sight. He froze, the barbell still rattling in the rack. "You look tired, Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried over the thumping bass of the gym's music. Guilt is a heavy weight to carry. It ruins the form. "Damon," he wheezed, sitting up and grabbing a towel. "I told you, I had nothing to do with—" "Stop. The lying is the most insulting part, not the betrayal itself. I expected that from a man who measures his worth in car wax. But the idea that you think I'm too stupid to see the strings." I leaned over him, placing my hand on the back of the bench. The board is looking for a fall guy for yesterday's disaster. Tommy is the obvious choice, but Madeline needs someone to blame for the technical corruption of the files. She's already looking at your access logs, Marcus. "What? No, I helped him. I stayed late." "Exactly. You were the last person to touch the server before the presentation. I made sure of it." I gave him a thin, joyless smile. "I didn't even have to do much. I just mirrored your credentials onto the script that delayed the remote. To the auditors, it will look like you were trying to sabotage Tommy so you could step into his role, which, let's be honest, was exactly your plan." Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. He reached for his phone, but I moved faster, pinning his wrist to the bench. Not enough to cause a mark, but enough to remind him that I was the one in control. "Don't call her," I warned. "She'll drop you the second she thinks you're a liability. Your only chance is to give me the login for the Meridian Horizon offshore account, the one you've been helping her hide." "I can't. I don't have it," he stammered. "Then you have nothing to offer me, and I have no reason to stop the audit from reaching your desk by 5 o'clock. I let go of his wrist and walked away. I didn't need him to give me the login. I already had it. I just wanted him to know that I had it, and to feel the walls closing in. The psychological pressure was far more effective than any physical confrontation. By the time I reached the exit, I saw him frantically typing on his phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice. I spent the afternoon in the city's public library, a neutral, quiet space where I could work, without the distractions of my own apartment. I began drafting the final components of the Meridian collapse. It wasn't about destroying the company, it was about purging the infection. As I worked, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't turn around. I could smell the perfume, expensive, floral, and entirely artificial. "You've become very difficult to find, Damon," Lara said, pulling out the chair next to me. She looked immaculate, though there was a tension around her eyes that suggested her morning hadn't been as productive as she'd hoped. "That was the intention," I said, not looking up from my screen. "What do you want, Lara? I'm busy." "I know what you're doing. Madeline called me. She's panicked. She thinks someone is leaking internal documents." Lara leaned in, her voice dropping to a sharp hiss. You're going to ruin everything. For what? A job? I can get you a better one. I can fix this. You already fixed it, remember? You fixed it so I was out and you were in. You sold me out for a consulting retainer. I finally turned to look at her. Her expression was one of practiced innocence, but it was slipping. How much was I worth to you, Lara? Was it enough to cover the audit that's coming for your firm? She went pale. What audit? The one regarding the Meridian kickbacks. The ones you didn't report to the Revenue Service. You see, when you decided to involve yourself in my professional life, you invited me into yours. And I'm very, very good at my job. Lara stood up, her chair screeching against the linoleum floor. Several people looked over. You're pathetic, Damon. You're sitting in a library like a hermit while the world moves on. You think you're some mastermind, but you're just a bitter man who couldn't keep up. If that makes you feel better, hold on to it, I said. But check your bank balance before you try to buy lunch. I think you'll find your liquidity has evaporated. She stormed out, and for the first time in a week, I felt a genuine sense of amusement. The family betrayal was the most personal, the one that had stung the most when I first realized the depth of her involvement. Seeing her composure shatter was worth every hour of meticulous data mining. Evening fell, and the city lights began to flicker on, a million tiny eyes watching the streets. I left the library and began the walk back to my car, but I noticed the same black SUV from the day before idling at the corner. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Instead of going to my car, I turned into a crowded pedestrian plaza. I moved with purpose, weaving through the tourists and office workers. I wanted to see who was behind the wheel. I ducked into a 24-hour pharmacy, moved through to the back exit, and circled around the block. I came up behind the SUV, which was now stuck in a crawl of traffic near the plaza. I walked past the driver's side window, glancing inside. It wasn't a professional hit squad. It was two men in cheap suits. Private security. Madeline's private security. She was so desperate to stop the leak that she was hiring rent-a-thugs to follow me. I didn't run. I walked right up to the driver's window and tapped on the glass. The driver rolled it down, looking startled. Can I help you? Tell Madeline that if she wants to talk, she should do it herself, I said. And tell her the Horizon account is currently being audited by an outside party. She'll know what it means. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and vanished into the crowd of a subway entrance. I spent the next 3 hours on the trains, switching lines, doubling back, and ensuring I wasn't being followed. When I finally returned to my apartment, I found a note slid under the door. It wasn't from Madeline or Lara. It was a single sheet of paper with a time and a location. Rooftop. Midnight. Bring the notebook. It was Tommy's handwriting. The arrogance had been replaced by a desperate, shaky scrawl. I checked the time. 11:15 p.m. I didn't bring the notebook. I didn't need to. The notebook was just paper. The real power was in the head of the man who wrote it. I did, however, bring a small digital recorder and a high-intensity flashlight. The rooftop of the Meridian building was an expanse of gravel and humming air conditioning units, overlooked by the glowing logo of the company. It was windy, the air carrying the scent of ozone and rain. Tommy was standing near the edge, looking out at the city. He looked smaller than he had in the office, his expensive suit rumpled and his hair a mess. You came, he said, turning around. He looked terrified. You asked, I replied, staying near the door. Why are we here, Tommy? Is this the part where you ask for my help to fix the mess you made? I didn't make it. You gave me those notes. You set me up, he shouted, his voice cracking. I gave you the tools. You're the one who didn't know how to use them. You accepted a position you weren't qualified for based on a friendship you didn't earn. That's not sabotage, Tommy. That's gravity. You simply fell. Madeline is going to ruin me. She's saying I embezzled the funds. She's pinning the Horizon account on me. He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched. You have the proof it was her. I know you do. Give it to me, and I'll tell the board everything. I'll tell them it was all her idea. And what about Marcus? What about Lara? I asked. They were all part of it. You were just the one holding the bag when the lights came on. I don't care about them. Just help me. I looked at him, this entitled shallow boy who had been used as a pawn by people far smarter than him. For a second, I felt a flicker of something like pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of him laughing with Marcus while I was escorted out of the building. I'm not here to save you, Tommy. I'm here to watch the architecture fail. I turned to leave, but the door to the rooftop swung open. Madeline Kerr stepped out, followed by the two men from the SUV. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. "That's enough, Damon," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "The game is over." I looked from her to Tommy, then back again. The trap was set, but I was the one who had designed the room. The third act was about to begin. The rooftop of Meridian Tech was a desolate landscape of gravel and humming machinery, a stage set for a finality that felt as inevitable as a winter frost. Madeline Kerr stood there, flanked by her shadows, her presence a sharp contrast to the chaotic wind whipping around us. Tommy stood between us, a shivering bridge of incompetence, looking from me to Madeline with the wide, vacant eyes of a man who realized he had been cast in a tragedy he didn't understand. "The game is over, Damon," Madeline repeated. She held a tablet in her hand, the screen glowing like a pale moon in the darkness. "I've spent the last 6 hours with the forensic team. We've traced the digital fingerprints you left in the system. The Horizon account access, the distorted data in the presentation, the unauthorized bypasses. You've been very busy." "Digital fingerprints are easy to forge, Madeline," I said, my voice steady despite the rush of air. I took a step back, positioning myself near one of the massive HVAC units. "Especially when you're the one who built the system. A forensic team only sees what the architecture allows them to see. And right now, it's showing them exactly what I want." "You think you're so clever," she hissed, her professional veneer finally stripping away to reveal the raw, jagged ambition beneath. "But you're just a disgruntled former employee with a talent for petty sabotage. You've harassed my staff, compromised my family. Yes, Lara told me everything, and now you're trespassing. I don't need a board meeting to handle you. I just need to turn this over to the authorities." "Then do it," I challenged. "Call them. But before you do, you might want to explain why Lara's personal boutique firm was receiving 5-figure monthly payments for market research that consists of copied and pasted Wikipedia entries. Or perhaps you'd like to explain why the Horizon account, which you claim I accessed, has been sending funds to a shell corporation registered in your husband's name." The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. Tommy's head snapped toward Madeline, his mouth hanging open. The two men behind her shifted their weight, their eyes darting to her for a signal. "You're bluffing," she said, though the tremble in her hand gave her away. "I don't bluff. I calculate." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping a command. "At this very moment, an automated email is being prepared. It's addressed to the board, the major shareholders, and a few choice contacts at the Financial Regulatory Agency. It contains every ledger, every invoice, and every message between you and my sister. It also contains the video from the gym, the one of Marcus Yates admitting that you were planning to pin the embezzlement on Tommy." "You liar!" Tommy screamed, turning on Madeline. "You said you were protecting me. You said Damon was the one stealing." "Shut up, Tommy," Madeline snapped, her composure fracturing. The scene was a beautiful disaster. I watched as the alliances I had spent years observing dissolved in a matter of seconds. The betrayal that had once been a unified front against me was now a circular firing squad. I didn't wait for the fallout. While they were occupied with their own internal combustion, I moved. I didn't run toward the door. I headed for the service ladder on the side of the mechanical penthouse. I had spent months studying the blueprints of this building. I knew that the service elevator in this sector was currently undergoing maintenance, leaving the shaft sensors in a manual override state. "Get him!" Madeline yelled. The two men in suits scrambled across the gravel. They were younger and faster, but they were hindered by their lack of familiarity with the terrain. I vaulted over a cluster of pipes and slid down the ladder, landing on the 9th floor balcony. I ducked into the interior hallway just as the first man reached the edge above. The office was dark, illuminated only by the rhythmic blinking of server lights and the occasional glow of a vending machine. I moved with a predatory grace, navigating by muscle memory. I needed to reach the basement levels before they locked down the elevators. As I moved through the marketing department, I took a moment to execute a small, personal piece of retribution. I passed Marcus Yates's desk. His prized glass award for innovation sat there, a hollow trophy for a man who hadn't had an original thought in a decade. I didn't break it. I simply took a heavy-duty adhesive from a nearby drawer and bonded it to the mahogany surface of his desk. It was a minor thing, a petty thing, but it represented the reality of his situation. He was stuck, permanently attached to a sinking ship. I reached the stairwell and descended 3 flights at a time. My mind was already on Lara. She was the one who had hurt the most, not because her betrayal was the largest, but because it was the most intimate. A boss's coldness is expected. A sister's is a fundamental breach of the world's order. I exited the building through the loading dock, slipping past a distracted security guard who was busy watching a sports game on his phone. The night air felt clean. I walked 3 blocks to a secondary vehicle I had stashed, a nondescript sedan that wouldn't trigger any recognition. My destination was Lara's apartment. I knew she would be there, probably packing or frantically trying to move funds before the bank freeze took full effect. When I arrived, the lights in her penthouse were blazing. I didn't knock. I used the spare key I had kept for emergencies, the kind of emergency she had now created. The living room was a mess of open suitcases and discarded paperwork. Lara was at her kitchen island, 3 phones spread out in front of her. She looked up when I entered, her face a mask of exhaustion and resentment. "Get out, Damon," she said, her voice raspy. "I've already talked to the lawyers. You have no right to be here." "I have every right," I said, closing the door and locking it behind me. I walked into the room, kicking aside a pile of expensive shoes. "I'm the one who paid for this lifestyle, Lara. Every promotion I earned, every bonus I shared with you, it all went into this. And you repaid me by helping Madeline draft a narrative that I was mentally unstable." "You are unstable," she shouted, throwing one of the phones at me. It missed, shattering against the wall. "Look at you. You're stalking people, you're sabotaging cars, you're acting like some kind of vigilante. Normal people don't do this." "Normal people don't sell their siblings for a consulting contract," I countered, my voice low and dangerous. I walked toward her, and she backed away until she hit the edge of the stove. "I found the emails, Lara. I found the one where you told Madeline that I was vulnerable after our mother passed away. You used my grief as a weapon to make me look weak to the board. You told her I was unreliable so she could bring in Tommy and you could handle the PR for the transition." Lara didn't deny it. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of frustration. "I needed the money, Damon. My firm was failing. I thought you could handle it. You're smart. You always land on your feet. I just needed a win." "And you thought my life was a fair price for that win?" I shook my head, a cold laughter bubbling in my chest. "You've always been a parasite, Lara. I just didn't realize you had graduated to a predator." I reached out and grabbed her laptop from the counter. "What are you doing? Stop!" I didn't answer. I opened the browser and navigated to her firm's public-facing website. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a script that replaced her portfolio with the invoices I had found, the ones that proved she was billing for work she never performed. Then I sent a final command to her bank. "There," I said, setting the laptop back down. "Your liquidity is gone. Your reputation is a matter of public record, and since you were so concerned about my mental health, I've taken the liberty of sending a full report to the Professional Licensing Board. I think they'll agree that your ethics are the real concern." Lara sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands. "I'm your sister. How can you do this to your own sister?" "I'm just following the blueprints you provided," I said. "You taught me that loyalty is a luxury. I'm just showing you that I've learned the lesson well." I left her there, sobbing in the middle of her expensive, empty life. The night was far from over. I drove back toward the center of the city, my eyes fixed on the horizon. The betrayal had a final layer, one I had only glimpsed in the data logs on the rooftop. Madeline hadn't just ignored the warnings about Tommy. She had actively encouraged his incompetence because she was using the Meridian Q4 project as a vehicle for a massive insurance fraud scheme. She wanted the project to fail. She wanted the servers to crash. She was planning to claim a total loss on the proprietary intellectual property and walk away with a payout that would dwarf the actual value of the company. That's why she hired Tommy, not because she liked him, but because he was the perfect scapegoat for a catastrophic technical failure. I was the only thing standing in the way of a $100 million fraud, and Madeline knew it. As I pulled into a parking garage near the waterfront, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. No text, just a video file. I opened it. It was a live feed from my own apartment. Madeline's 2 men were inside, systematically tearing the place apart. They weren't looking for data. They were looking for the blue notebook. They thought the physical evidence was the only thing that could stop them. I watched as they smashed my computer, overturned my furniture, and ripped the upholstery from my chairs. They looked like animals, frantic and clumsy. "You're looking in the wrong place, Madeline," I whispered to the empty car. I put the car in gear and headed toward the one place where the final act had to happen, the Meridian Server Center. It was a hardened facility on the outskirts of the city, the heart of the company's digital existence. It was where the Q4 rollout was currently being staged. If Madeline wanted a catastrophic failure, I was going to give her one. But it wouldn't be the kind she could collect insurance on. It would be the kind that would leave her holding nothing but the wreckage of her own ambition. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, but my eyes were bright with a cold, clear purpose. The underdog was done playing defense. The 5th act was coming, and I was going to ensure that when the lights went out, I was the only one who knew how to find the exit. The Meridian Server Center sat like a monolithic tomb of black glass and reinforced concrete on the industrial fringe of the city. It was a place designed to survive everything from seismic shifts to electromagnetic pulses, but it was not designed to survive the man who had written its internal security protocols. I pulled into the shadow of a warehouse across the street, the engine of my car clicking as it cooled. The air here was heavy with the scent of salt from the nearby docks and the low-frequency hum of a million cooling fans. I checked my watch. 1:14 a.m. The final board meeting, an emergency session called by Madeline to address the crisis, was scheduled for 8 a.m. at the headquarters. She would spend the next several hours trying to scrub the digital record and prep Tommy for his role as the sacrificial lamb. She didn't realize that while she was looking for the files I had already leaked, I was moving for the jugular, the physical core of the company. I approached the perimeter fence. Most people think of hacking as a process of lines of code and flickering monitors, but the most effective hacks are physical. I found the junction box for the external sensor array. Using a small handheld frequency jammer, I created a 30-second loop in the feed. To the security guard inside, the screen would show a static, empty stretch of asphalt. To me, it was an open door. Once inside the facility, the temperature dropped. The data halls were kept at a precise, chilling temperature to prevent the processors from melting under the weight of their own calculations. It was a cathedral of blinking blue and amber lights, a maze of floor-to-ceiling racks that held the collective memory of Meridian Tech. I made my way to the central node. This was where the Q4 rollout resided, the intellectual property that Madeline intended to lose in a staged crash. I sat on the floor, my laptop connected directly to the backbone of the system. I wasn't there to delete the data. Deletion is a loud, traceable act that leaves scars. I was there to encrypt it using a key that only I possessed. As the progress bar crept forward, my phone vibrated. It was a call from Madeline. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but the urge to hear the cracks in her voice was too strong. "Damon," she said, and I could hear the sound of a car moving at high speed in the background. She was on the move. "I know where you are. The GPS on your car's last known location put you near the center. You need to stop this. If you touch those servers, you aren't just a disgruntled employee anymore. You're a criminal." "The word you're looking for is witness, Madeline," I said, my fingers flying across the keys as I bypassed a secondary firewall. "I'm looking at the Horizon logs right now from the source. It's a very interesting trail. You've been siphoning the infrastructure budget for 18 months. No wonder the servers were prone to crashing. You were buying refurbished parts and billing the company for top-tier hardware, pocketing the difference. The insurance claim wasn't just a backup plan, it was the exit strategy for your embezzlement." "No one will believe you," she snapped. "I have the board in my pocket. I have the records that show you were the one who authorized those purchases." "You have the records I let you have. But here's the thing about a house of cards. It only takes one breath of truth to bring it down. I've already sent the real invoices to the internal audit committee. Not the ones in the blue notebook. The real ones. The ones with your digital signature." I hung up before she could respond. The encryption was at 90%. Suddenly, the lights in the server hall flared to full brightness. The heavy security doors at the far end of the room hissed open. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The heavy tread of work boots on the metal grating told me that Madeline's hired hands had arrived. They were fast. I'll give them that. "Step away from the console, Vossel," a voice boomed. It was the lead security man, the one who had wedged the SUV in the alley. He looked frustrated, his cheap suit jacket strained over his shoulders. I hit the final enter key. The screen turned black, then displayed a single, pulsing cursor. "The data is locked," I said, standing up slowly and raising my hands. "You can take the laptop, but without the sequence, those servers are just very expensive heaters." The two men approached me cautiously. They weren't there to talk. One of them reached for my arm, but I stepped back, using the momentum to swing a heavy metal cable spool into his path. He stumbled, his partner lunging at me. I wasn't a fighter, but I was a man who understood leverage and environment. I ducked beneath a low-hanging cooling pipe and sprinted into the labyrinth of the server racks. This was my territory. I knew every blind spot, every narrow crawl space, and every emergency shutoff. I led them on a chase through the cold aisles, the sound of their heavy breathing and cursing echoing off the metal surfaces. I pulled a fire suppression lever as I passed a junction. A hiss of inert gas filled the aisle, creating a white, opaque fog that blinded them. I doubled back, moving through a maintenance tunnel that led to the rooftop HVAC platform. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow, a welcome relief from the recycled atmosphere of the server room. I reached the edge of the roof and looked down. Madeline's car was idling at the gate. I pulled a small remote from my pocket. It wasn't for the servers. It was for the building's fire alarm system. The sirens began to wail, a deafening, piercing shriek that would trigger an automatic response from the city's fire department. In a facility like this, A fire alarm meant an immediate evacuation and a lockdown of all exits. I watched from above as the two men scrambled out of the loading dock, coughing from the suppression gas. Madeline stepped out of her car, shielding her eyes from the strobe lights of the alarm. She looked up and saw me standing on the edge of the roof, silhouetted against the glowing Meridian logo. I didn't wave, I didn't shout. I simply held up the small USB drive that contained the encryption keys, the only thing that could save her company from total digital paralysis. Then I turned and vanished into the darkness of the rooftop mechanical structures. I made my way down the external fire escape on the opposite side of the building, reaching the ground just as the first fire trucks began to scream toward the facility. The chaos was perfect. In the confusion of the emergency response, I walked calmly toward the perimeter fence, slipped through the gap I had created earlier, and returned to my car. I wasn't finished. The peak of the revenge wasn't the theft of the data. It was the public exposure of the architects. I drove toward the city center, heading for the Meridian headquarters. I had one final task to perform before the 8 a.m. board meeting. I needed to ensure that when Madeline walked into that room, she wasn't walking into a meeting she controlled, but a theater of her own making. I arrived at the headquarters at 4 a.m. The cleaning crews were the only ones there. I used my old credentials, which I had reactivated for a 4-hour window using a ghost account, to enter the main boardroom. It was a lavish space, all glass and mahogany, overlooking the city. I went to the central projector. I didn't just upload the evidence, I integrated it into the very template of the company's internal communication system. Every screen in the building, from the lobby monitors to the tablets in the break room, was now synced. I sat in Madeline's chair at the head of the table. It was a position of power, but it felt hollow. I realized then that I didn't want her job. I didn't want her money. I wanted the satisfaction of watching the mask fall off. I wanted the world to see the rot beneath the polish. My phone buzzed. A message from Claire Sanders. Damon, what have you done? The internal network is displaying invoices. My computer is showing a live map of an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Everyone who's logged in early is seeing it. I'm just providing transparency, Claire, I typed back. The family culture Madeline loves so much deserves to know how much she's been charging for her affection. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to rise, a sliver of gold breaking over the skyline. In 4 hours, the board would arrive. Tommy would arrive, likely hungover and terrified. Marcus would arrive, his car still acting as a mobile prison, and Madeline would arrive, thinking she still had a move to make. I felt a strange sense of peace. The architecture of my retribution was complete. Every betrayal had been accounted for. Every lie had been countered with a more devastating truth. There was no redemption at the end of this road, no quiet retirement or apology. There was only the inevitable collapse of a corrupt structure. I heard the distant chime of the elevator. Someone was arriving early. I stepped into the shadows of the coat closet, leaving the boardroom door slightly ajar. It was Tommy. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. He walked into the room, went straight to the coffee station, and then stopped. He saw the projector. He saw his own name on a document titled Scapegoat Protocol, Technical Failure Analysis. He stood there for a long time, the steam from the coffee rising in the cool air. Then he sank into a chair and began to laugh, a high, thin sound that bordered on hysteria. He finally understood his place in the machine. I watched him, my inner commentary as sharp and cold as a winter morning. He was the first to realize the truth, but he wouldn't be the last. I checked the time. The final act was beginning. The board members were starting to pull into the garage. Madeline's car was spotted entering the perimeter. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that one of its largest tech giants was about to be dismantled from the inside out. I adjusted my collar and prepared for the climax. There would be no epilogue. There would be no explanation given to the press or the authorities that I didn't personally curate. When the dust settled, I would be a ghost again. But the memory of what happened in this room would haunt them for the rest of their professional lives. The door to the boardroom swung open fully. Madeline Kerr walked in, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She didn't see Tommy at first. She went straight to the window, looking out at the city she thought she owned. "It's time," she whispered to herself. "I agree," I said, stepping out from the shadows. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was the only payment I required. The boardroom felt like a pressurized chamber, the air thick with the hum of the cooling vents and the heavy electric scent of an impending storm. Madeline Kerr stood frozen by the window, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. When she turned to face me, the shock on her features was quickly replaced by a desperate, frantic calculation. She looked at me, then at the hysterical Tommy slumped in the corner, and finally at the massive display screens that were currently broadcasting the intimate details of her financial deceptions to every terminal in the Meridian network. Damon, she said, her voice strained, attempting to reclaim a shred of her former authority. Whatever you think you've achieved here, it's over. The security team is already on their way up. You've trespassed, you've interfered with a secure facility, and you've compromised proprietary data. You're not a hero, you're a liability that is finally being erased. I was already erased, Madeline. That's what you don't seem to understand, I said, leaning against the mahogany table. I felt a profound sense of stillness. You can't erase a ghost. You can't fire a man who has already walked out. I'm not here to save my job or even my reputation. I'm here to ensure that the architecture of this company reflects the reality of its leadership. The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and the board of directors began to file in. They were men and women who moved with the slow, heavy confidence of inherited power. Marcus Yates was among them, trailing behind like a beaten dog, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't managed to fix his car. He had arrived in a taxi, looking disheveled and broken. As the board members took their seats, their eyes immediately drifted to the screens. The scapegoat protocol document was still visible, clearly outlining Madeleine's plan to use Tommy's incompetence as a shield for her own embezzlement. The room went silent. It was a vacuum of sound, the kind of quiet that precedes a total structural collapse. Madeline, the chairman of the board began, his voice like grinding stones, perhaps you can explain why the internal network is currently a public record of your private interests. Madeline opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at the screen, then at me. I offered her nothing but a steady, indifferent gaze. She had spent her career manipulating people's perceptions, but she was now standing in a room where the truth was being projected in 50-inch high definition. It's a fabrication, she finally stammered, pointing at me. Damon Vossel has spent the last 48 hours systematically attacking our infrastructure. He's a disgruntled former employee who is trying to mask his own failures by framing me. This is a hack. None of this is real. I tapped a key on the tablet I had been holding. The display changed. It wasn't a document this time. It was an audio file. I hit play. Madeline's voice filled the room, a recording from her car earlier that morning. I don't need a board meeting to handle you. I just need to turn this over to the authorities. The insurance claim wasn't just a backup plan. It was the exit strategy. The recording continued, capturing her admission of the Horizon account's purpose and her intent to let the Q4 rollout fail. The board members didn't look at her anymore. They looked at the table. They looked at their own hands. The betrayal was no longer a secret. It was an environment. The servers at the center are encrypted, I told the board, my voice calm and resonant. Madeline's plan for an insurance payout relied on a technical failure, but I've ensured the failure is hers alone. The data is safe, the project is intact, but the keys are currently held by a neutral third party, an independent auditing firm I contacted at 3 o'clock this morning. They are waiting for a signal from a new, interim leadership to begin the restoration. The chairman looked at me, a flicker of something like respect crossing his face before it was buried under a mask of corporate pragmatism. And what is your price, Mr. Vossel? I don't have a price, I said. I'm finished here. I just wanted to make sure the blueprints were accurate before I left the site. I turned toward the door, but Madeline stepped into my path. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a primal, cornered energy. You think you can just walk away? You've destroyed everything I've built. You've ruined Lara. You've ruined Marcus. You've destroyed a legacy. No, Madeline, I said, leaning in so only she could hear me. You built a house on a fault line. I just gave it a little shove. As for Lara and Marcus, they were the ones who chose to be part of your foundation. It's only fair they're there for the collapse. I pushed past her. Behind me, the room erupted into a cacophony of shouting and frantic phone calls. Tommy was finally being led out by security, not for my trespassing, but for his complicity in the initial fraud. Marcus was being cornered by 2 board members who were demanding to see his personal logs, and Madeline was standing in the center of it all, a queen whose kingdom had turned into a cage. As I reached the lobby, I saw the morning sun flooding the atrium. It was beautiful, a clean, white light that seemed to wash away the stagnant air of the last 8 years. I walked toward the revolving doors, my footsteps echoing on the marble. A figure was waiting for me near the exit. It was Lara. She looked different, shorn of her poise, her expensive clothes wrinkled, her hair unkempt. She didn't look like a high-powered consultant anymore. She looked like a woman who had realized the person she had sold out was the only person who had ever actually been on her side. Damon, she said, her voice trembling. They're at my office, the auditors. They're taking everything. Please, you have to tell them it was a mistake. You have to help me. I stopped and looked at my sister. I saw the girl who used to steal my lunch money and the woman who had tried to steal my life. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a need to hurt her further. I just felt nothing, a perfect, polished vacuum. "The mistake was mine, Lara," I said. "I thought we were part of the same structure. I won't make that error again." "I'm your family," she cried, reaching for my arm. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Family is a blueprint, Lara, and yours was faulty from the start." I walked through the revolving doors and out onto the street. The city was in full motion now, the roar of traffic, the sea of pedestrians, the frantic energy of a million lives intersecting. I felt invisible, a single grain of sand in a desert, and it was the most liberating feeling I had ever known. I walked toward the parking garage, but I didn't head for my car. I kept walking. I crossed the street, moved through a public plaza, and entered the subway station. I took a train to the waterfront, watching the urban landscape blur through the window. At the pier, I stood and watched the dark, churning water of the harbor. I took the USB drive from my pocket, the one Madeline thought was the only key to her salvation. It was a small piece of plastic and metal, a tiny object that had held the weight of a multi-million-dollar empire for a few hours. I didn't throw it into the water. That would be dramatic, a cliche I didn't care for. I simply dropped it into a heavy-duty trash bin filled with coffee cups and discarded newspapers. It was where it belonged, among the refuse of a world I no longer inhabited. My phone buzzed one last time. A news alert. Shake-up at Meridian Tech. CEO ousted amid embezzlement probe. Below it was a picture of Madeline being escorted from the building, a jacket draped over her head to hide her face from the cameras. I turned off the phone and removed the SIM card, snapping it in half and letting the pieces fall through the slats of the wooden pier. The revenge was complete. It hadn't been a loud explosion. It had been a systematic dismantling, a quiet removal of the load-bearing pillars until the roof simply sat on the floor. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, and no turning back. I had played the role of the underdog until I had become the master of the game, and now that the game was over, I was done. I walked away from the water, heading toward a part of the city I had never visited before. I had no job, no family, and no professional standing. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a mind that was finally, for the first time in a decade, free of the Meridian architecture. The sun was high in the sky now, burning off the last of the morning haze. The streets were loud, vibrant, and indifferent to the fall of a tech giant. I blended into the crowd, a face among thousands, moving forward into a future that had no plan, no specs, and no blueprints. I reached a busy intersection and waited for the light to change. To my left, a street performer was playing a frantic, driving rhythm on a set of plastic buckets. To my right, a woman was arguing with a taxi driver. The world was messy, chaotic, and beautifully unplanned. The light turned green. I stepped off the curb, my pace steady and sure. I didn't look back at the skyline, where the Meridian logo still glowed faintly against the blue. I didn't think about Madeline's face or Lara's tears. I thought about the next meal, the next street, and the absolute terrifying beauty of being a ghost in a world of solid things. The architecture was gone, the site was cleared, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to build what came next.